Good evening, everyone. My name is Meg Pierce. I am the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for being here, for taking some time to learn about this important policy issue that affects all of us here in Pennsylvania. For your awareness, this webinar is being recorded, but as a reminder, as this is a webinar, no one's camera is turned on apart from our presenters. However, we do encourage you to engage with the presentation via the chat and the Q&A function of the webinar. There will be time at the end of the presentation for questions. So we encourage you to ask questions as we go, and then we'll save them for the end. And a reminder that closed captioning is available in this Zoom webinar. And to enable closed captions on your screen, just click the Show Captions button in your Zoom taskbar. And of course, if you need any more assistance with closed captioning, please send us a note in the chat. And if we can improve accessibility for you in any other way, please just let us know. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We begin this time together with a land acknowledgement. Colonial Pennsylvania boundaries were drawn in 1681 over original nations' land. We acknowledge the ownership of original Indigenous peoples honoring the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We name the great nations of Pennsylvania, the Erie, Iroquois, Munsee, Delaware, Shawnee, Ohio Valley, Susquehannock, and Lenape. We honor all original nations of the past and those living among us today. With that, a warm welcome again to our event, and I will turn it now to Susan Boser, who is our Director of Social Policy for the League.
Thanks very much, Meg. And I also would like very much to welcome everybody tonight to our discussion about gun safety in Pennsylvania. We have three panelists that are going to be speaking with us this evening. Our first one is Shannon Flores. Shannon is the coalition manager of Giffords Gun Owners for Safety. Giffords is a nationwide organization, and Shannon will be providing an overview of their Gun Owners for Safety program here in Pennsylvania. Then we're going to hear from Carol Lastowka, who is the Southeastern Coordinator for CeaseFirePA Pennsylvania, and we'll discuss their advocacy work in Pennsylvania. Our third panelist will be Sean Holihan, Giffords State Legislative Director. He'll share his insight on the status of legislation in Harrisburg. I really would like to thank all three of you for participating, and as well as those of you who are joining us, and let you know there'll be some questions or opportunity for questions at the end. So Shannon, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Susan. We really appreciate the chance to share with you and have worked with the League in other states, so I appreciate the time. So again, my name is Shannon, and I am based just outside of Houston, Texas. And I love your beautiful state. Actually, my sister and my in-laws live in Pottstown, so northwest of the Philadelphia area. So I'm going to first begin with a little background information about Giffords, and then I'll talk about our Gun Owners for Safety program before I turn it over to Carol, who is one of our leading members. So Giffords, which you may know, is led by the former and courageous Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who survived a horrific shooting in 2011. After the Sandy Hook Elementary School mass shooting in 2012, Gabby launched the organization that we now know as Giffords. So it's dedicated to saving lives from gun violence. We are the only national gun violence prevention organization that is led by both a survivor and a gun owner. Many people don't know, but Gabby and her husband, Mark Kelly, Senator Kelly, are gun owners. And she inspires the team at Giffords every day, and I am so lucky to be able to do this work. Giffords works closely with our state partners across the country, and especially in Pennsylvania, and we help allied lawmakers in Harrisburg who want to take action and pass common sense gun laws. Specifically for the work that I do, I organize gun owners across the country who are also concerned. And Giffords started organizing gun owners specifically in 2019. And the idea is we created a home for common sense gun owners who are responsible, gun owners like myself and Carol who are concerned about gun violence and want to take action. So we have thousands of members across the country. We launched our first 3 state chapters in Colorado, Minnesota, and my home state of Texas in 2019. In 2020, we launched virtually in the state of Michigan. And last year, we added 3 more chapters in Florida, Virginia, and in your state of Pennsylvania. So the research and polling on gun violence prevention and policy priorities on gun owners specific shows that the majority of gun owners, both Democrats and Republicans, even NRA members, support action to reduce gun deaths and injuries, contrary to the rhetoric that you hear typically. So our Gun Owners for Safety members are committed to supporting reasonable regulations that serve the safety of citizens in Pennsylvania and across the country. And we have 3 guiding principles. And after my piece, I will share our website in the chat for you to learn more. We are united by a belief that we can defend our constitutional rights and support gun violence prevention laws. They are not mutually exclusive. We are guided by a devotion to safe and responsible gun ownership. And we want to hold close to heart and have compassion and empathy for the victims, survivors, and families impacted by gun violence. Pennsylvania Gun Owners for Safety is a proud member of CeaseFirePA's Common Agenda, which you'll hear more about that later. And we have had gun owners from across the state who are concerned and they're raising their voice. Last year in 2022, we had gun owners join CeaseFirePA in Harrisburg to lobby for common sense gun legislation. I want to share some recent data from the CDC that dropped in December. So based on the 2021 numbers, in 2021, 1,905 people died from firearm injuries in Pennsylvania. And so that's actually a 9% increase in the gun death rate in Pennsylvania over 2020. Unfortunately, both firearm homicide and the firearm suicide rates increased across the state. So the firearm homicide rate rose 8%, and tragically, but not surprisingly, firearm suicide rate rose 11%. We know that the majority of gun deaths in Pennsylvania and nationwide are firearm suicides. So that's kind of the background details, and it's now, I believe, Carol's turn, Susan, and I'm not sure if I need to introduce Carol or if you. I'm happy to do it either way.
That would be great if you'd go ahead, please.
No worries. Sorry, we should have done that at the top of the call. My apologies. So I am very proud to introduce my friend, my close friend. I got to meet her through this work, Carol Lastowka, who is a leading member of the Pennsylvania chapter of Gun Owners for Safety. She also happens to be a CeaseFirePA, the Southeastern Coordinator for CeaseFirePA, who's our state partner in the GVP space. So Carol joined the gun violence prevention movement from a belief that responsible gun ownership and gun safety must go hand in hand. She's a lifelong hunter and gun owner, and she is dedicating her life to advocating for legislation to protect Pennsylvanians, specifically from irresponsible gun use. She wants to raise the voices of gun owners and survivors, working with politicians who support the common agenda to end gun violence. She also wants to hold accountable those who don't. She's a Susquehanna County native, and I'm sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, Carol, and she relocated to Southeast PA after serving in the U.S. Peace Corps. Carol is a Penn State alum. She volunteers with 2 refugee resettlement agencies, and she enjoys Latin dancing.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that nice introduction. I am thrilled to be here. Susan, thank you so much, and Meg for the invitation to be a part of this. So a little bit about me. Shannon gave you a brief preview, but I really want to share with you my story because I think it might resonate with some of you. So I grew up in the boondocks in Susquehanna County. Town is named Little Meadows. You can look it up on the map, and if you blink and you've gone through it, right? So I grew up surrounded, I guess, by a family culture of hunting. I did not know what a steak from a cow was like, right? So it was always like venison. If I went to somebody's house and they had beef, it was like, what is that? Venison in everything. And I remember like some of my earliest memories of my dad and cousins. They would go hunting out in Western PA. We'd go visit my grandparents out in Sugar Grove, and they'd be dragging their deer back through the snow. And, it was just like this joyous camaraderie that they had gone out and they were able to provide meat for their families. And so when I got old enough, I decided I would like to get in on this family tradition. I took a hunter safety education course when I was a young teenager, and took it with my mom actually in a pizza shop in Montrose, Pennsylvania, and learned the basics about gun safety. I started hunting with my dad and have been hunting ever since, except for a brief spate where I was, oddly enough, a vegetarian. So yeah, it's sort of been all over the place. And then I got married, I went in the Peace Corps, I had kids, I have 2 sons, I became a teacher. And then, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I went to a town hall shortly after a mass shooting down in Delaware County, which is where I live now. And at that town hall, it was on gun safety. A guy stood up at the end for the Q&A and he said, "It's my God-given right to carry an AR-15 down the middle of the street if I want to." And I thought to myself, I do not want this man speaking for me. And so I went up afterwards and I spoke to the people leading this town hall and I said, "Hey, I'm a gun owner and I actually totally disagree with this guy. Like, there has to be responsible gun ownership." And the people who were leading it were gun violence prevention advocates. And they said, "Oh my gosh, really? You own a gun and you feel safe talking to us?" I was like, "Yeah, I sure do. And I would love to talk to you." So they invited me to a meeting and I decided to write out my speech. And as I was writing my speech, I came at it from, at first when I went in, I thought like, oh yeah, I use my gun to hunt. And then I started thinking about throughout my life, all the impacts that gun violence has had on my life and those around me. And I thought back to when I was in grade school, a boy who rode the bus with me, he was a year younger. I'm not going to say his name because it's an unusual name and maybe somebody out here would recognize him, but he went into his dad's truck and opened the glove compartment and there was a pistol and he decided to see if it was loaded. He pointed it at his hand and it was loaded. And Dexter went to the hospital and he survived, but not all children are as fortunate. When I was in high school, a classmate in my Spanish class, Rich, he sat next to me, he was a nice guy. He just didn't come to school after break. And Rich, it turns out there was an unsecured gun in the house and Rich killed his father and then he took his own life. I've lost a cousin to gun suicide, another cousin to an unintentional shooting, and an old boyfriend that I had in the first grade. He was my very first boyfriend. We grew apart, but he was murdered serving a warrant to a meth lab in rural Bradford County. And I started to just think, wow, that's a lot of people. I need to speak up. I need to do something. And so I decided to use my voice to speak up for responsible gun owners, which we know, and I'm sure that Shannon and Sean probably have the data, that the majority of gun owners really want responsible gun ownership to be happening, and they are responsible about it. But our legislators don't seem to be listening to us. And so what I started doing at CeaseFirePA about a year ago, I got hired on and I decided maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can save a life. Maybe I can save a lot of lives. This is a long fight. It's going to be a long fight, but I'm in it for the long term, as long as I'm able to. And so I've made it my mission to talk to people and let them know that gun owners are not against gun safety. We don't want people to get shot. We don't want bad guys to get their hands on guns so that they can hurt people. And so what CeaseFirePA does is we work at the grassroots level and also the grass tops level to educate people about common sense gun reform. And common sense means, like, we're not coming to take your gun away, right? We're not coming to take your gun away. What we're trying to do is to prevent gun deaths and gun injuries through legislation, such as universal background checks. So you can go to a gun show and you need to go through a background check if you're purchasing a gun in Pennsylvania from a federally licensed dealer. But if I wanted to sell you my rifle because I'm a private seller and I'm not federally licensed, you don't need to undergo a background check, right? It doesn't make much sense. So that's just one of the things that CeaseFirePA is doing. We've had some great successes in recent, like in the last year. CeaseFirePA and our advocates lobbied at our advocacy day in Harrisburg last year in April. And as a result of our advocacy and the support of legislators who want to see an end to gun violence, we were able to triple the amount of money that the state is investing this year in gun violence prevention programs. Happy to talk about some of that later. But another initiative that we're taking is extreme risk protection orders. We would love to see that legislation passed. That is protective legislation, protection orders. It's not punishment. It's a civil protection by which, let's say my adult son, of which I have two, by the way, is, let's say he has a gun, and let's say he's been pretty depressed. If that were the case, and let's say he refuses to give up his gun, I can go to law enforcement or a judge and say, hey, can we temporarily remove this? And it would give legal means to do that. Extreme risk protection orders, sometimes they're called red flag laws. They look different in different states. In some states, a doctor would be able to request an extreme risk protection order. And some people say, well, what about facetious claims? What if I just want to get even with my ex-boyfriend? There are severe penalties, very strict penalties in states against that. And so there's also a burden of proof upon the person. They actually need to, who's bringing this claim, they need to provide proof that there is, that this person is a danger to themselves or to others. And in states like California, extreme risk protection orders have been proven to prevent mass shootings. Again, I'm sure Shannon has that data ready if we need it. So another initiative is safe storage. So we all hear stories about the 2-year-old who gets the gun and ends up shooting themselves, a brother or a sister, a parent, a teacher. That is preventable. It's either human carelessness or just plain stupidity. If we leave a gun out, a lethal weapon out, unlocked, unsecured. If we are able to legislate that requirement, it will save lives. It will save children's lives and babies' lives. There is no reason not to do it. My rifles are stored in a large safe with a combination lock. There are all kinds of locks that range from anywhere from about $6 or free from the sheriff's department, no questions asked, up through thousands of dollars. And now you can get biometric locks. People say, well, what if an intruder breaks in? If you feel the need to have a handgun, you can have a biometric lock that is bolted to your bed or your bedside stand. And in less than a second, you can open it with a press of your finger. So there's no excuse not to lock up your gun. The final piece of legislation that we are really hoping to get passed is lost and stolen reporting. Lost and stolen reporting would help to stop straw purchasing and illegal firearms trafficking in the state. There was just a a gun trafficking ring that was broken up in Pennsylvania. It involved a lot of law enforcement investigation, and want to applaud them for getting the job done. But it was a network that purchased guns all throughout the Lehigh Valley and Southeastern PA. They purchased a total of 94 guns that we know of. 29 of those guns have been recovered. 65 are still in circulation. So we don't know where they are, right? And there were 23 additional attempts that were not completed to purchase those guns. Now, the interesting thing about this, for me, I think, is that, well, a few interesting things. Half those guns were purchased at gun shows, including the Oaks Gun Show. With anybody listening in this, like, Southeastern PA, it's a huge gun show. They hold it frequently. And so gun shows throughout the state. And the purchases were made throughout 8 counties. I'm going to name those counties because maybe you'll hear yours. Montgomery, Bucks, Chester, Philadelphia, Lehigh, Columbia, Northampton, and York. The guns that were recovered as far away as Pittsburgh and Connecticut. So here's what happens and what part of this ring was. Let's say I go to a gun show and I purchase a bunch of guns. I can legally purchase guns, right? I don't have a dangerous background or a criminal record or anything like that, right? I go to a gun show and I buy a whole bunch of guns, and then I sell them to people who can't pass background checks. That is what these people were doing. So 65 guns out there without background checks. Now, this is a ring and it got busted, right? But as an individual, could I get away with it? There's a good chance I could. And here's the problem with Pennsylvania. We do not have a lost and stolen gun reporting requirement. So let's say that one of those guns that I bought and then resold turns up at a crime scene. Guess what? They run the law enforcement runs the numbers on it. And guess what happens? They come back to me and they say, Ms. Lastowka, how did your gun that you purchased wind up at a crime scene? And I can just say, oh, man, it got stolen. And they'll say, well, you need to report that. I say, well, maybe next time. And there's no legal requirement for me to report it. There's no accountability. We need to hold gun purchasers accountable. When you lose your car, or you don't usually lose it, but when your car, unless you're at the airport parking lot, when your car gets stolen, right, you report it. Shouldn't the same thing be true for firearms? So with that, I'm going to pass this on to Sean, and I will look forward to answering your questions. And actually, before I pass it on to Sean, just one quick thing. I wanted to invite you all to come to Harrisburg with CeaseFirePA on March 23rd. It's a Thursday. We are setting up meetings with legislative offices. We're going to have a big rally. And as many of you probably know, the legislature, at least the House, has just started having session. And we want to send a strong message that Pennsylvanians, people all across Pennsylvania, not just in the big cities, are in favor of reforming our gun laws to make it harder for dangerous people to get their hands on a gun, and to make it so that our kids stop getting shot, and to make our Commonwealth safe again. Okay, thank you. Somebody, I think, needs to introduce Sean.
So, John, first of all, thank you very, very much, Carol. That's a powerful message, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say. I'm also interested in the discussion that we're going to have towards the end. But for right now, you talk about the status of legislation here in Pennsylvania, and that's actually, I think, where our next look should be. Where do we stand? What is Pennsylvania doing with regards to these things? And for that, we're going to turn to you, Sean. Sean is the State Legislative Director for Giffords, working here in Pennsylvania. And so he's been keeping an eye on what's been going on here in Harrisburg. And I really look forward to his comments. Sean.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that. So a little background on me. I've been working at Giffords for the last 2 years as their state legislative director. So I take a nationwide view of everything that's going on across the country when it comes to gun violence prevention. Obviously, each state is different. Pennsylvania is as different from Ohio as it is from New York to New Jersey and Delaware, and that's just neighboring states. The laws that Pennsylvania has are a little behind places like Delaware and New York, but they're a little bit better than places like Ohio and West Virginia. So the things that we've been working on in Pennsylvania, just are a little bit different because of the demographics and the makeup of the legislature. So while we have a Democratic majority in the House and a Democratic governor, we also have a pretty conservative Republican state Senate. So it's important that whenever we talk about gun violence prevention and legislation as a whole, we always set expectations so folks understand that this is a long road. And as Carol talked about, this is a long fight. When we talk about gun violence prevention, sometimes you find yourself being able to pass a bill in 1 or 2 years, and other times you take on really tough issues. They're very emotional, and they can take a decade to pass something like this. So I've actually been working in Pennsylvania for a long time. I was a consultant with CeaseFirePA dating back to the previous executive director, Shira Goodman. I did all their communications work and fundraising and political work. So I'm very used to talking about things like preemption and lost and stolen reporting. These are things that we've been talking about in the Commonwealth for a very long time, unfortunately. I do feel like we are on the right road, and Carol and I had a conversation about this earlier. We're seeing, unfortunately, mass shooting after mass shooting, and because of that, people are really paying attention to the issues of gun violence and trying to figure out, how to get a handle on this. We're also seeing some pretty radical rulings by judges across this country that don't make any sense. We just saw a Fifth Circuit judge panel out of Texas say that domestic violence abusers should be able to have access to a weapon. We know that there is a 1,000% higher likelihood of someone who's being abused to die at the hands of their abuser if there is a weapon in the home. There's a clear one-to-one connection to domestic violence, death, and having a weapon in the home. And yet we still saw a panel approve that. So, we have a real difference of opinion, and this, like, as I said, it's a long road. What we have in Pennsylvania right now are your real bread and butter issues. These are issues that Carol was talking about: universal background checks, ERPO or red flag laws, safe storage, and lost and stolen reporting. Whenever we work in states that are purple or red, we often talk about passing legislation that just makes it harder for bad guys to get guns. This is a very simple talking point. We also talk about gun owner responsibility. We want gun owners to feel like they're a part of the solution to make their communities and states safer. And so they have a responsibility to keep their gun locked up if there's a child in the home. They have a responsibility to report if their gun has been lost or stolen. We want to work with law enforcement to make sure that they can help close cases. If we get the closure rate up, that means there are less criminals walking around with illegal guns. And gun owners play a huge part in that. So a lot of these laws that we're trying to pass are really just setting the foundation for where gun laws have to be. And that is, we have to make sure that if someone with a criminal background in Pennsylvania wants to go purchase a weapon, they can't just go online and buy one from a private dealer. Because right now in Pennsylvania, you can go online, buy a gun from a private dealer without a background check and get that weapon. If you want to go to a federally licensed dealer, you do have to have a background check. And if you do have a criminal background, you will be rejected. So those, I saw there's a question in the chat about some of the processes that people have to go through in order to get a license from a federally licensed dealer. Those things do exist, certainly, yes. But it is all too easy at this moment to get access to weapons. And that is the sort of the problem that we have in this country. We do have mental health issues. Every country in this world has mental health issues. America has a uniquely gun violence problem. And that's because getting access to a firearm is incredibly easy. So when we talk about gun violence, we talk about mental illness, it should be, something we can talk about at the exact same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We should be able to address mental illness in this country, and we should be able to make sure that people who shouldn't have access to a weapon shouldn't have one. And so these bills will be heard. They're constantly brought up in the assembly, even with a Democratic majority. Keep in mind, it's only one seat. So getting every Democrat in every room to agree on everything is very difficult. But that's where you all come in. Your voice is incredibly important right now. In New York, where Democrats have a supermajority, our voices are less important. It's more about leadership and how they are table setting their agenda and what they're pushing through. When you have a one-seat majority, your voice just becomes that much more powerful because everyone is a swing vote. And so if we're getting constituents to engage with our legislators and say that we need responsible, poll-tested, popular legislation, the things that Carol and Shannon talk about, these are things that are polling 80%, 85%, 90%. They poll plus 50%, 60% with gun owners. They poll a majority of Republicans. These are things that we all believe in. And so going back to my point about people paying attention to these issues because of judicial rulings and because of gun violence and in both in their community and in mass shootings, is that we're starting to see people become maybe not single issue voters, but voters who care about gun violence, and they think about it when they go to the ballot box. Democrats often care about choice and the environment and labor issues and a host of other things. There's a lot of things they think about when they go to the ballot box. And for a long time, the Second Amendment side have had voters who, they represent maybe 20% of the voting public, but they are there and they show up to every single election and they care solely about gun violence and Second Amendment issues. What we're seeing now on the other side is that we're starting to develop voters who really care about gun violence, and they think about that when they go to the ballot box. So if we can get those folks, and hopefully we have a few of them here today, we can get you all to start engaging with your legislators. We might be able to kick this, through the House chamber and force the state Senate to pick it up and start talking about it. I will say it's going to be very difficult to get these bills through the state Senate, but that doesn't mean we can't continue talking about it, educating people on it, getting them engaged, and making it a priority for people in the state Senate. But there is there's a silver lining here, and Carol brought this up. Pennsylvania is a leader on funding community violence intervention programs. I mean, they have really shown the rest of the nation how important these issues are, because this funding helps stop gun violence on the micro level. What we're talking about are people who are incredibly invested in their community. These are faith leaders, these are community leaders. Some of them are former gang members themselves. They are people who understand why a shooting is occurring. So if there's been a shooting in, somewhere in Philadelphia, and if we have a program that's being funded, those people who are working on the ground know why that shooting happened. And so what we try to do is, have these peacemakers go in there and talk to these folks and try to get them out of the cycle of violence. We're also working with hospitals for hospital-based violence intervention. So if someone is admitted with a gunshot wound and it becomes readily apparent that they were involved in a criminal activity, or if they were subject to criminal violence, we can work with them by getting the mental health professionals, job counselors, getting them out of the cycle of violence. And if those programs are funded, there's about a 20% less likely chance that that person will be admitted with another gunshot wound or wind up dead. So Pennsylvania is really showing the rest of the nation that this funding is something that could stop violence in inner cities. And so I'm hoping that there's at least a little bit of ray of sunshine here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that we can, celebrate. But happy to take any questions. One of the things that Carol and I talked about before this call is that, she is the expert in Pennsylvania. I'm the national guy, and I have a bit of a national perspective. So happy to talk about any issues that are going on in states across this country. But Carol is the one that's on the ground, and she has these relationships with legislators. So I actually really lean on her to talk about these issues.
Okay, wonderful. Sean, thank you so very much.
May I jump in?
Sure.
Just to follow, if that's okay, Susan.
Oh,
Just
yeah,
to
of course,
follow up on-
absolutely.
As long as we're talking about community violence intervention, thanks, Sean, so much for bringing that up. And I'm not sure that I know any more about Pennsylvania than you do, but we'll see. Maybe we can tag team. So yesterday, I had the great opportunity to actually visit a community violence intervention program, and I just wanted to share with you about it. It's like Sean was saying, it is really a bright spot in Pennsylvania, I think. So you may have heard of the city of Chester, which is in Delaware County. It has an extraordinarily high crime rate. And through a variety of efforts, both through law enforcement, as well as through CVI programs, the murder rate in Chester is dropping. But I got to be a part of an organization yesterday. They took me in as a volunteer. I had to go through background checks and child abuse clearances. And so I spent the morning in a couple of schools, providing safe passages for children coming to and from school. The group is called Safe Corridors. You can look them up if you want to. And they are credible messengers. The guys who work in Safe Corridors are often formerly incarcerated individuals who have past histories about, they were possibly pushers. They've been involved in gangs, like Sean said, and seeing them connect with the youth was amazing. Kids coming up and calling them Mr. Bro. Just amazing. A couple of the men told me that some of the students actually call them dad. And they show up every day. They're outside the school, but then they've started a pilot program where they're going into the schools as well. All day in their one school, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, a little bit under 2,000 students. There are 12 workers. They wear these yellow vests. It says Safe Corridors on them. And if they see a kid wandering around, they help them. They also provide like, hey, get to class. So it's not all, touchy-feely, lovey-dovey. There's accountability there too. And the school is running well. And they said there's been such a turnaround since they started going into the school in October. And they said, yeah, some of these kids are active, which means they're gun owners and gun users, but they're not bringing them to school. And the violence isn't happening around the school. And the parking lots are safe, which you do not see at a lot of schools. So seeing the love that these guys and women have for the students was so inspiring. And I can't help but think that by having these stable adults providing mentorship and setting an example of responsible, just like what it is to be a human being, is going to change those students' lives and show them that there is a way, there is a path that they can follow that doesn't involve guns and violence.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks very much, Carol. Meg, you want to go ahead and facilitate questions?
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of Q&A questions. Folks, if you have additional questions, please continue to ask them in the chat. Haley had a couple of really nice comments about messaging around gun safety. And her question is, what exact measures do you think are most effective in combating the problem of, quote, the wrong people accessing guns? Whoever wants to take that.
I guess I can take that. So the question was of wrong people accessing weapons. So, I mean, everything goes back to universal background checks. We have to make sure that if someone wants to purchase a weapon, they're not the wrong person purchasing a weapon. And so every federally licensed dealer in this country has to run a background check. There is, however, a loophole, even with background checks. In most places in this country, you have 3 days for 3 business days for a dealer to wait for the FBI's NICS system to come back with a background check. Now, if the federal background check doesn't come back within 3 days, that dealer can go ahead and sell the weapon regardless. This is called what's normally, infamously the Charleston loophole. So the Charleston loophole is called that because of, unfortunately, the shooter who went into the Charleston church and took a number of lives. He shouldn't have been able to purchase a weapon, but because of the waiting period, that was only 3 business days, he was able to get access to one. So when we work on this type of legislation, we often try to expand the number of days that, to at least 10, for instance, that a dealer would have to wait for the federal background check to come back. The reason is because, going back to domestic violence, oftentimes when there is a lag in reporting, it's because there are domestic violence misdemeanor issues that are being lost in the system. It takes a little bit longer for that to go back to the dealer. And we found that through DOJ data, 99% of domestic violence misdemeanors will be caught in a 9-day period. And so that all this goes back to background checks. And so if we have, every time someone goes to buy a weapon, no matter if it's online, a gun show, a private dealer, a family member, well, actually, that's not true. We have out clauses for family members giving, weapons to their son or grandfather or something like that. But we just need to make sure that, bad guys aren't getting guns. This is a very simple thing that we try to get states to do. It's one of the last, hallmarks of bipartisanship that we can sometimes get Democrats and Republicans to agree upon. And we're hoping, finally get something like this passed in the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much. We had a question from Arlene, who asked, how can gun storage laws be enforced? And they also added that they would like to see AR-15s and AK-47s banned from civilian ownership.
I'll take the first one, certainly. So the way that we talk about safe storage laws, it almost seems like big government's going to come kick down your door and make sure that your guns are locked. This is not what we do. What we do is hold people accountable and ensure that if, we have people who have children in a home, that they lock up their weapons. If a child is to get hold of a weapon and then something unfortunate happens, there's an accidental shooting, that child goes and, carjacks someone, then we can hold the parents or a person who lives in that home and owns the weapon accountable. That is what we usually refer to safe storage as child access prevention, just because it sounds like government's not coming in and, the governor's not looking around your home to make sure there's not, a lock on your firearm. So that is actually how we try to just prevent children from getting a hold of these weapons. And that's what we mean usually when we say safe storage. As far as the semi-automatic weapons, that is something that Giffords is not pushing in Pennsylvania at this moment. Oftentimes we are asked to work on that legislation in states where, it is something that is being supported by majority of folks. We just worked on legislation like that in Illinois. There are, however, many different types of caveats, and it's very nuanced law. People who own semi-automatic weapons are able to keep them so long as they are registered, so that if they're found at the scene of a crime or if they're sold to someone else, we know that, who that weapon belongs to. former law enforcement, former military are able to keep their weapon. And so it's just we often are talking about this, but it's a very thorny issue, and it's something that can divide people who are talking about responsible poll-tested legislation. Banning assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons is something that is still popular, is still above 50% with voters, but you're still talking about far, far below your universal background checks and your red flag laws.
Thank you, Sean. And Shannon, I know you wanted to add to Arlene's question.
Oh, yes. So actually, I think that was Kaylee's question in reference to mental health. So Kaylee had a question that Sean mentioned in reference to universal background checks is the best way. The good news is that we have made progress. So you may know that last June, the first piece of significant gun legislation in the last almost 30 years passed with bipartisan support. 15 Republicans joined Senate Democrats to get past the, what's the term, Sean? I'm blanking right now. 60 vote threshold in order to get the bill passed. And then, of course, President Biden signed that piece of legislation in last fall. It's called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. BSCA is the acronym I use because that's a really long name. But the good thing is there were lots of really great components in the bill, CBI funding that Carol and Sean have mentioned, closing background check loopholes and data related to domestic violence, but also a huge chunk of mental health funding for youth mental health, funding for mental health resources. And so I know that lots of times we get the argument that, well, it's a mental health problem. It is a mental health problem, and we need to address that. But we also need to address, to Sean's point earlier, how easy it is in this country to get a weapon if you are intending to use that weapon to harm others. So that is good news, and I'm happy to share with Susan and Meg the funding number, because I don't know that number by heart, but the good news is there is funding available for states and schools and other community partners to use to address the mental health issue.
Thank you. We had a great question from Anne asking if our panelists could discuss the problem of gun violence in Philadelphia and how our mayor and city council are not able to have the authority to put gun violence prevention laws into place. Could you speak a little about that city to state dynamic?
Sure. So most cities in this country are beholden to the state legislature. Just like there are some laws that states can't pass because Congress does not allow them. Unfortunately, many cities across this country would readily pass strong background check laws and not having guns in certain areas, things like that. But there's a thing called preemption, and preemption blocks localities from being able to pass laws that are stronger than what the state code already allows. So that's been something that Pennsylvania has been fighting with a lot. So much so that a few years ago, legislators actually passed laws that would allow people to sue and get funds from a locality if they had been damaged by some of their gun laws. That is like a very extreme example of the gun lobby and gun manufacturers getting into Harrisburg and trying to attack localities just for making their communities safe. So unfortunately, until we're able to pass preemption and allow localities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, Scranton, to be able to pass laws about who can have a gun and who cannot, and where guns can go, like they're still just beholden to whatever legislators pass in Harrisburg.
We had another great question from Kathy asking to talk a little bit more about ghost guns, a problem that seems really insurmountable, the fact that you can make a gun in your house with a 3D printer. Would anyone like to address that?
So I can talk about that again. I don't want to take up all the oxygen in the room. But so the Department of Justice actually did issue a ruling on ghost guns that they are illegal. However, they still exist. We know that the technology is out there and people are still able to produce ghost guns. More often than not, what was happening is that people were buying pieces of weaponry online, and then making the rest of it in their garage. In a lot of parts of this country, you're not able to buy that stuff online anymore because it's just the DOJ and the federal law enforcement are able to crack down on that kind of thing. But in the dark web, you're able to download anything. And if people have the technology in their homes to make this kind of equipment, it's very easy to mass produce weapons that are unserialized. So you can use a ghost gun at the scene of a crime, drop it on the ground and walk away, and they'll have no idea where it came from. So we're trying to get every state across this country to pass ghost gun laws to ensure that, technology doesn't exist. We can go after people who own a ghost gun. I mean, the idea that someone could make a weapon in their own home is, I think, very frightening. And I think there's a very easy understanding that the kind of person that makes a ghost gun in their home is not using it to go hunting. They're using it because they want to be able to commit crimes and not be caught. So ghost guns are incredibly dangerous, but we're working with the federal government to crack down on them. We've got several states across this country who have passed ghost gun legislation, and we're hoping Pennsylvania at some point in the near future will be one of them.
And Carol, I saw that you also were interested in weighing in on this question.
Yeah, so I did want to add that, so I believe it was last summer, there was a new regulation, maybe it was April, I'm not sure exactly when, but a new regulation requiring ghost gun parts to be serialized, which actually has changed things. I was at the Oaks Gun Show before the ruling went into effect, and I was at the Oaks Gun Show after the ruling went into effect. There was sort of a mad scramble for what they call 80% kits, which were the ghost gun kits. They're called 80% because 80% of the gun has already been manufactured and 20% of it has not. So you need to spend about an hour putting it together with parts, but all of the parts come in like little bags or little boxes. And I just went to the gun show recently, and they're all serialized now, which is good. It is a move in the right direction. And so I did just want to bring that up. It's harder now to purchase the main parts of a gun.
Thank you.
Sure.
We had a great question from Joyce, who says that Sean mentioned it would be very difficult to get some of these common sense laws passed in the Republican majority Senate that we have currently in Pennsylvania. Can you speak to the principal objections that Republican lawmakers have to these laws?
Sure. So I don't want to get too political, but the main problem that we're having with many different issues across this country is just the polarization of issues. I mean, things are politicized. And so the NRA started handing out grades on different policies and votes decades ago. And so even if you have someone who is pretty moderate, just wants to vote on economic issues and wants to bring jobs back to their community, they're still going to be dinged on their record in a Republican primary if they vote on any of these issues. For instance, in Maine, we passed one of these child access prevention laws where if a child gets a hold of a weapon and something horrible happens, we can at least hold the parents or the residents who own the weapon accountable. The gun manufacturing lobby in Maine decided that that was a slippery slope towards taking everyone's weapon away. Everything is a slippery slope towards taking a weapon away. And so no law, no matter how responsible it is, no matter how popular it is, even if 90% plus of people decide that this is a law that makes sense, the NRA, sportsmen's groups, the gun manufacturing lobby are still going to say that it's a horrible vote against the Second Amendment. And that vote then gets graded against someone in a Republican primary. So really what this is it's because of the political structure we have in this country, where we have people who are running in, very dark red districts. And, this is a thing that could cost a Republican their seat in the state Senate, unfortunately. And so it makes it very difficult for them to be the, 1 or 2 or 3 votes on an issue. So oftentimes, we try really hard to work across the aisle, try to make this safe for Republicans who stick their neck out and, want to make their communities safer. But it's very hard for them. I'm not making excuses. But I am letting people know that even if, I'll just say this, the number of Republicans I've had private conversations with who say they are with me, they understand how important this issue is, but they just can't stick their neck out. It's too many to count. And so that, I think, is the main problem. The secondary problem is that many of them actually believe that voting against the Second Amendment on any of these issues is a slippery slope. They do believe that more guns make people safer. And that is something, unfortunately, that is, very good marketing by gun manufacturers, because if you make people afraid, if you make people scared of their guns being taken away or of crime, they will go out and buy weapons. And that's just more money in the pocket of gun manufacturers. And that's a messaging that has worked really well in this country.
Thank you, Sean. I think we have time for one more question. We just had another question in the chat about how to combat the gun suicide rates and suicides in general. And Shannon indicated she was willing to answer that. So go ahead, Shannon.
Yes, thank you. I put some details in the chat, and I believe you can see answered questions on the back end. But there was a question about how to reduce suicide rates. And I think we need to have a conversation about two key policies that luckily Carol and CeaseFirePA have in their common agenda. So just a little bit about me. So I grew up in a hunting background. I'm a daughter of a veteran. I'm a gun owner. I'm married to a gun owner. But my family we lost my uncle to gun suicide. And there's this misnomer that suicide is inevitable, but that's not the case, right? We have seen from research and reports is that most times it is a knee-jerk reaction in a moment of crisis. And so the policy that Sean and Carol have talked about, extreme risk protection orders, is ideal in this scenario. So my family knew that my uncle struggled with depression. It was well known, but my home state of Texas has no means to take action when someone is in crisis. And that's an extreme risk protection order. If that policy is missing, there is nothing that families like mine can do to try to intervene, right? And so that's why it's such a very powerful piece of legislation. Yes, it reduces mass shootings. That is proven. Yes, it also reduces suicides. And across Pennsylvania, the majority of gun deaths in your state, in rural parts of the state, Carol has these data points. You'll know which counties have the highest rate. It's suicide. And so this, I think, is one of the policies, especially if you live in a rural part of the state, if you know or have a network of individuals who suffer from suicidal ideation, is to share that story with your lawmaker, because this is the best way to reduce gun deaths in the state, which a majority of our suicides is through extreme risk protection orders. And the second, I know we're going long, the second policy that helps reduce suicides is storage. Because if you can slow down access to lethal means, then with hope, they will get the help they need. But if it is easily accessible, if it is on the nightstand, if it is in the drawer, when someone is at their lowest, we know that a firearm is the most lethal means. And so storage, in addition to extreme risk protection orders, can reduce suicide. And that data is proven. We have that data from other states. Sean and I can find it for you if you want to go down that rabbit hole, that these are policies that can reduce suicide across the Commonwealth.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Well, that concludes our Q&A. We'll be sharing resources after, because I think there were some things we couldn't answer and a lot of folks wanting to dig in more. So Susan, I'll pass it back to you.
And I would really just like to thank, first of all, Shannon, Carol, and Sean for the preparation of time to put this together tonight, and then to share your knowledge and also your passion with us about these issues. And thank you for the very good work that you're doing to educate and to advocate on these issues, and your leadership for us as well. To all the participants we had tonight, I am also very grateful that you came and shared. I appreciate the interest invitations to Carol to come and speak, opportunities for additional communication. A couple of things I want to highlight. I want to highlight Carol's mention of the fact that on the 23rd of March, there will be an advocacy and rally day organized by CeaseFire in Harrisburg. And through either their website or through connecting with us, we can make the links available for you for that. And then, and Carol, I don't believe that you mentioned it, but you'd made mention to me earlier that CeaseFire offers learning institutes that can be available to people as well. And if you can reach out to Carol, she provided some information for that in the link. She can get back to you about exactly what those would involve and how to arrange for it as well. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. If there's follow-up questions or information you need, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.